Julian?
Yeah, I think this, actually, I was speaking last year at this conference on the notion of the public interest. It is absolutely not the case, as the PCC would tell you, that the public interest is difficult to define. There are lots and lots of definitions of the public interest, and most of which all, in fact, end up saying more or less the same things. In my view, the fullest account of what constitutes the public interest is to be found in the BBC editorial guidelines, for example. But you can find lots of other things as well. You can look at the Information Commissioner's Office, you can look at the guidelines on the prosecution of journalists that the Crown Prosecution Service has recently issued. There are numerous things you can look at, but they all in the end up saying roughly the same thing. So I think to put it very, very briefly and as concisely as I can, it is what information which is in the public interest is what people need to know in order to be able to function effectively as active members of a democratic society. That, I think, is what is in the public. It's what's in the citizen interest and not what's in the consumer interest. It's not the same thing as what some members of the public happen to be interested in, which of course is precisely, as Steve said, the kind of verbal conjuring trick which people like Kelvin Mackenzie tried to carry out. So there are definitions of the public interest. Pete's question about, is there anything that any activity that shouldn't be covered by a public interest defence? I don't think there is. I mean, I would actually defend, as I think David Lee has actually tried to do, you can defend phone hacking, in my view, if you've used phone hacking to uncover something which it is in the public's interest to know about, if it's to do with the commission of a crime or to do with corruption or whatever. So I think that always the public interest defence must fall back on, is this in the public's interest to know? I mean, again, some of you I know here will be familiar with things like the Reynolds defence, for example, or the case of Jamil, the libel case. There again, the law lords erected in the Reynolds defence and in Jamil a perfectly workable definition of the public interest. We really mustn't allow ourselves to be deflected by people who have a vested interest in saying that you can't define the public interest, or it's just what the public's interested in. That's just nonsense.
Jean, public interest, would you like to offer a definition, a working definition? Is there anything that shouldn't have a public interest defence?
Well, by definition, a proper public interest defence has to be an incredibly flexible set of principles, and that would be not a set of practices, not a set of exclusions. And in the end, you don't want to end up with the Russian constitution, which guaranteed you everything but gave you nothing. So I think the public interest, I rather disagree with Julian. I don't think it's incredibly easy to define, because one of the things I'm very aware of, for instance, having worked on Northern Ireland and BBC in the 70s and 80s, is that quite often the public just can't bear what it ought to be interested in. I mean, it really doesn't want to know about what's going on in Northern Ireland. And indeed, every time you put it on the 9 o'clock news, the entire nation with one hand switched off. And the BBC was able to say, but actually Northern Ireland is so important, it's such a nationally important thing, we'll go on covering it on 9 o'clock news, even though, as it were, the public just can't bear it. So the public interests are rather complicated. That's not a very good example. Paul Dacre would love me to say that. So I think it's what you need to know in order to be a democratic citizen. But that's also quite broadly that's also quite broadly defined. But that's so. I don't know. Sorry. And I'm as much interested in the practice of it, the kind of people and the values and the qualities of judgment, as it were, that make it live, as I am in any kind of bit of written thing. So I think that you could have a code of practice, but unless you've got not the heroes, you never need heroes. That's the good thing about practice. You don't need heroes. You need people who will live up to a practice because it's set to them rather than be lived down to a practice because it takes them down. So I think you need the culture and the people and the judgment as well as the code. But that's not a very good answer.
My wonderful smartphone isn't actually working very wonderfully. I was using the time to try and download my my own evidence.
It's too quick. It won't download.
Yeah, this is my own. It says web page not available. This is my own witness statement to Leveson because I did actually define the public interest, and I was I've completely forgotten what I said. And actually, Julian was there at the time. He did it as a sort of seminar style, and Lord Justice Leveson, to give him credit, did actually spend some time going through this. But essentially, you'll all be familiar with the watchdog model of journalism, and that's what, for me, that's what it's about. It's about protecting the public from danger. It's about exposing corruption and wrongdoing and incompetence in high places. It's the accountability model of journalism. It's what most of the people that we teach on journalism courses actually go into journalism to do. And I've said before at a number of conferences that journalism students that come into this place and to Goldsmiths and Kingston and City and wherever do not go in saying, I have a burning desire to hide in bushes, take long lens photographs of celebrities, jump on people when they're not expecting it, pay private investigators to go and find out people's private medical records and stalk people to find out if they're screwing someone else. That is not why people go into journalism. And what the public interest defence would do, and I have argued strongly that it should be a statutory defence, there should be a statutory public interest defence, which is actually called the Public Interest Defence Act, which is a standing defence to every single crime. Now that is quite radical, and there are certainly criminal lawyers who hate the idea, but currently the Bribery Act, Official Secrets Act, there are at least two more, have no, well obviously phone hacking, otherwise we wouldn't be where we are today, has no public interest defence. They ought to. If someone knows or has a very good idea or has a tip-off that there is an illegal arms deal going on involving the chief executive of a major corporation or a cabinet minister, and the only way you can verify that information is by picking up one of those people's voicemails, of course that should not be a criminal offence. It beggars belief. If you have to slip someone some money, a court official some money, to find out that there are lies being told in Parliament, which did actually happen in the 1980s, it's a different case, which is quite interesting, then of course that should not be a criminal offence. But there has to be a very clear dividing line. And what really makes me angry is the fact that there is a public defence being used to the Data Protection Act. The Data Protection Act, under which the 15,000 transactions that were found at Glenn Mulcair's address involving journalists paying him to get people's private medical records, private vehicle records, private mobile phone data, none of those have been prosecuted, primarily because there is potentially a public interest defence. And I've seen, Paul Staines, Guido Fawkes has published one of the 4 books of evidence. So you can actually have a look at some of that if you want, and I defy any of you to find anything in there which can be remotely defended on public interest grounds. So there is a balance to be done, and we can do that. Our democratically elected MPs can do that, and they can actually send a signal, exactly what Jean was saying, send a signal to newsrooms that will protect the young journalists of tomorrow who actually want to do decent journalism.
Okay, can I raise another issue as well of public interest and be slightly devil's advocate? I don't want to be, I'm sure I will be portrayed as a cat's paw of Paul Dacre, yes, which I'm not. The argument that I will put forward, and I'll put forward to the panel, is one that I got from Paul Foote, who I don't think could have been accused of being a cat's paw of Paul Dacre. Which is that, however desirable in abstract sort of regulation of the fairly appalling things that go on in the press might appear to be, one should be careful of what one wants, because you might get it, and the consequences of what you might get are not necessarily what you might want. And the examples that Paul would have given are familiar to me, because I come from the same political background as he did, are that when a Race Relations Act was introduced into Britain, the first person to be prosecuted for incitement to racial hatred was a Black Power activist. If you read histories about the 1930s, you will find that about the 1936 Public Order Act was introduced to stop Oswald Mosley's fascists wearing black shirts. I personally have been arrested twice under the 1936 Public Order Act on anti-fascist demonstrations. Yeah? And one could go on like this. Yeah? So you are all advocates of increased press regulation. You have, fairly clear what you want. You want a public interest defence and so on. But do you not have any worries that if you get what you want, how it will actually end up being used may be actually not what you want? Julian?
Absolutely, yes. I mean, I couldn't agree with you more, and I could think of some other examples to back up the case you've made. That is why it seems to me to be so extremely important, as Steve has just argued, that if we are going to have a public interest defence written into the laws, it has to be because one cannot necessarily trust the people who enforce the laws to enforce them sensibly. There are numerous examples one could think of where the police in particular have used anti-stalking legislation to intimidate and attempt to prosecute people who are protesting against various forms of environmental destruction. So I completely take your point, but that's why it's important that the law should be as well drawn up as possible. I mean, I'm one of those people. I mean, I am, chair of the campaign for Press and Broadcasting Freedom, and I'm also on the advisory board of Index on Censorship. So I think I have a reasonable history in trying to defend freedom of expression, not absolutely any kind of expression. Everybody would agree, that there are limits to be drawn somewhere. Child abuse material would be a good example, and there are certain laws in this country which undoubtedly are oppressive. The Official Secrets Act is a particularly good example of that. And, along with the NUJ, the CPBF has campaigned for a long, long time that should be liberalised. But again, one of the ways in which we have always argued that it should be liberalised is to introduce a proper public interest defence, so that, abuses by the security services can be exposed, or things which are really embarrassing to the government and not, as they would say, damaging of national security can be exposed. So, long before Leveson, I've argued that there's a real need for a proper public interest defence in numerous laws, which will enable serious journalism to happen. But to come back to the earlier point, it must be drawn up in as clear and watertight a way as possible. Otherwise, given the society we live in, Pete, yes, it will be abused.
Steve, G, would you like to make a